So there is power in prayer. I know it. You know it. I've experienced it. Likely you've experienced it. My guess is you're praying people. You probably wouldn't be here if you weren't. Am I right? You probably already prayed today. Probably prayed yesterday. Probably will pray tomorrow. Probably prayed a month ago. Probably will pray in a year from now, right? I mean, prayer is this powerful tool that God gives us to be connected with Him. But prayer is also something that is vastly understood. And this parable that we are looking at this morning, actually we're looking at two parables on prayer. The one parable that we're looking at this morning is greatly misunderstood. It is wrongly preached regularly. I have never preached it wrongly, I don't think. I didn't go back and look at 30 years of sermons to make sure that I didn't, but I think that's a pretty true statement because I've never understood this parable in the way that so many people take it to mean. As you know, we have been working on a series of parables, looking at the parables that Jesus tells. They're stories that have a point. And the point of parables often is to get us to understand some kind of teaching, something about God, something about ourselves, something about life, something about Jesus, something about other people. And you know as well as I do that if somebody just told you what it is they want you to understand, the chances of you remembering that are slim. I mean, think back to when you were a kid. Your mom and dad told you who you could play with and who you couldn't play with, or they told you to do this and not do this, and you maybe remembered and ignored them. But if you suffered some kind of consequences for ignoring them, or they told you some kind of a story, and that story stuck with you, like, you know, if you tell a lie, your nose is going to fall off, or, I mean, that's a dumb example, but, you know, some kind of a story, whatever they're trying to teach you would stick with you better. And so Jesus tells stories, parables, so that we get and we remember what He's trying to tell us. And so this morning, let me also say that part of the reason that He tells parables so that we remember is not so that we remember, but so that we apply it. Because if you know what the teaching is and you don't apply it to the way you live your life, it doesn't do any good to know it, right? I mean, I knew where my mom and dad told me not to go. And I knew what would happen to me if I went there. And if I went there, it happened, just as they said it would. And so if I didn't apply what I knew to my life, it didn't do any good to know it. And so this morning, we are looking at two parables that Jesus tells in this same chapter, Luke 18. And both parables are about prayer. And as I already said, prayer is a powerful force that we have available to us in our relationship with God, not because we can manipulate God with our prayers, is it powerful, and not because but because we can stay connected with God, is prayer powerful in our lives. You see, prayer invites God into our lives. Prayer reminds us of the power that God has in our lives and in the world. Prayer takes us to a deeper level in our relationship with God. Prayer is powerful, but not in the way we sometimes understand it. And that's what I want to talk about this morning. You see, Jesus' first parable in Luke 18 is about a widow. We often call it the parable of the persistent widow. And it's about this widow who is in a dispute with an enemy, so Jesus says. And she goes to an unjust judge, and she asks the unjust judge to help her settle this dispute. But the unjust judge ignores her. And so she comes back to the unjust judge again and again and again and again and asks him to help her settle this dispute with her enemy. And then finally, the unjust judge is sick and tired of this widow who's pestering him, and he grants justice for her. And so most often we hear this parable saying to us, if you want God to act on your behalf, just keep pestering him. Right? I mean, you've heard it. Maybe you believe it. Maybe that's how you operate in prayer. You know, if you just keep laying it before God, surely God will get tired of hearing you and he'll meet your need, or he'll provide whatever it is you want. Another way we spin this out in our understanding of this parable is, if we get enough people to pray, surely God will listen to us, right? I mean, I'm not saying there's not value in continuing to pray, and I'm not saying that there's not value in getting lots of people to pray, because I know when I've been going through stuff, just knowing that I had a whole bunch of people praying for me has strengthened me. It's in when the problem comes when we think that we have within us the power to tell God what to do, or we think that we can manipulate God by vast numbers of people joining us in that effort. But that is not what this parable teaches. Not even close. And if you want to draw any connections to the constant pestering in the parable, the only connection that I see that you can draw is that the more you pray about something, the more you stay connected to God. Because prayer is a conversation with God. Prayer is connecting with God. And the more we pray about something, the more connected we are. Now, I've talked about it a little bit previously, but in our second church, this is our third church as pastors for Sharon and I. In our second church, about a couple of months after being there as co-pastors in a time and a half position, it was a large church of about 350 in the Lancaster County area. And in that second church, we were there just a couple of months when it started going south quickly. Actually, it was going south before we got there. It was going south under the previous pastor. It was going south under the pastor before the previous pastor. We just didn't know all that, and when we got there, it just all broke loose again with us. It had nothing to do with us, but it had everything to do with the way we were feeling and the environment in which we were pastoring. And so we began to pray, and we prayed, and we prayed, and we prayed that God would give us a way out. Because nobody likes to stand up before a group of people or be called on to lead a group of people who don't want you there and don't like you, right? And so we prayed and we prayed and we prayed that God would give us a way out, and God did not immediately change the situation. But as we prayed and prayed and prayed, we more deeply connected with God. And God gave us the strength and the confidence to stand in the midst of that situation. We were there for 2.5 years, and it hit the fan early on. You see, God is not a genie or a Santa Claus, and our prayers do not manipulate God. So what does this parable teach? It's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. I know you were thinking it. I think this parable teaches us that we can trust God to be just. Now you see, the judge in this parable is not God. Just like last week, the master in the parable was not God. The judge in this parable is not God. And here's your clue. He's an unjust judge. God's not unjust, who doesn't like people and doesn't fear God. So it's not God, right? It's an unjust judge. And Jesus' point in telling this parable is that if the unjust judge will act in a just way and provide justice for the persistent widow, then how much more can we expect God, who is the definition of justice, to give us justice? He used that tactic in the talking about the sparrow and how much more God cares for us. If God cares for the sparrow or the lily, how much more does he care for you? You see, God loves us deeply, and when we stay connected with him, he offers us his strength and he grants us justice. Now notice, there's no talk about granting us what we want or what we need, and most often our prayers are more about what we want than what we need. We get confused on that sometimes. We think that our needs or our wants are our needs, but really they aren't. No matter the challenges we face here on earth, God grants justice. God is present in our lives. In the end, for those of us who remain connected to God, he gives us victory. He doesn't always give you exactly what you're asking for or what you think you need, but in the end, if you stay connected with God, he gives you victory. And so what we learn from this first parable is that we can trust God to be just, that we need to stay connected, and that we need to keep the faith that God is who God is. The second parable is also about prayer, and in it, Jesus contrasts two kinds of prayer by sharing the prayer of two very different people. A Pharisee. Now, you know, a Pharisee, they were the religious elite. They were the who's who among the church of that day. The Pharisee, the who's who in the church, stands up before God and beats his chest, like Tarzan, and says, "I thank you, God, that I am not a sinner like everyone else." Now, how's that for the opening line of a prayer? And then he goes on, he says, "For I don't cheat. I don't sin." Well, he just lied. Maybe lying's not a sin. And he says, "I don't commit adultery. And I am certainly not like the tax collector. I fast weekly, or twice a week, rather, and I give 1/10 of my income to you." What kind of prayer is that? I mean, I can just picture him standing up there, beating his chest and saying, "Thank you, God, that I am not like everyone else, for I don't cheat, I don't sin, I don't commit adultery, and I certainly am not like the tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I give you 1/10 of my income." That prayer has nothing to do with God at all. It mentioned God. I thank you, God, that I am not. But it's about the Pharisee. It's about the Pharisee from beginning to end. I wouldn't even call that prayer. That's just this Pharisee talking about himself. That's just the Pharisee reminding God, as if God needs to be reminded, that the Pharisee is important and great and wonderful. It reminds God of the things that God already knows. It is intended to elevate the Pharisee, pure and simple. It really has nothing to do with God. And so put that prayer against the prayer of the second person that Jesus lifts up, and that is a despised tax collector. Now, we don't like tax collectors today, right? Nobody likes anybody like paying taxes? I guess I'm kind of odd in that. I don't mind paying taxes because I know that a lot that happens in our community and world happens because we pay taxes. I don't like it when I do, especially when it's the dollar amount that I have to pay. And unlike most of you who work for an employer, as an employee of the church, I'm not really I am, but I'm not. In the IRS eyes, I have to pay quarterlies. And, the church doesn't pay half of my FICA tax. I pay it all. So I have to come up with more money than most of you who have a job and get part of that paid and covered by your employer. But I still don't mind the taxes. But most of us don't like the taxes and don't like tax collectors. And in Jesus' day, it was no different. And tax collectors were even worse than they are today because they were very, very, very dishonest. See, a tax collector in that day could say, you owe $100 tax to the government. But I'm here to collect $200 and you have to pay it because the government said, whatever I can get from you as a tax collector, it's fair game. Now that doesn't make a tax collector very liked, does it? Because everybody knew it was going on. And so Jesus says, the despised tax collector. So get this image. You got this elite of the church and this low-life scum of the earth tax collector. And the tax collector prays, and Jesus says he stood at a distance and dared not even lift his eyes to heaven as he prayed. Instead, he beat his chest. Now, the other guy wasn't beating his chest. I'm sorry. It's a tax collector that was beating his chest. The tax collector beat his chest in sorrow, saying, listen to his prayer. It's one line. It's a one-liner. O God, be merciful to me, for I am a sinner. O God, be merciful to me, for I am a sinner. What a vastly different prayer than the prayer of the Pharisee. And what a simple prayer, yet powerful prayer, yet profound prayer. It recognizes God's place in the world and in the tax collector's life. And it recognizes that God has the mercy to extend. It's God's to extend it. And it recognizes that the tax collector, a sinner, is in need of God's mercy. This prayer from beginning to end is all about God, not the tax collector. Prayer is not about manipulating God or elevating ourselves. The power of prayer is in the connection to God and in the vindication that God offers his people. And that vindication comes in the form of mercy. So humble yourself and cast yourself on the mercies of God. In fact, that's how Jesus ends this section of his teaching. He says, for those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. As we experience the mercies of God, we experience the provision of God as well. Now, not in ways that we expect or request or demand, and not often in the time frame that we expect or dictate the provisions of God to come. At our second church, we experienced God's mercy as he strengthened Sharon and I to last those 2.5 years. He molded us. He deepened our faith in him. And while I wouldn't have said it then that I'm grateful for that experience as I was going through it, as I look back on it, I am very grateful that God gave us that experience. Now, in a little more than a month, at the end of September, Sharon and I will have had the privilege and honor of serving you as your pastors for 20 years. 20 years. Seems like a lifetime. But then in some ways it seems like just yesterday. And when we were in the midst of the battle in our second church, we would have never, ever dared to dream that 20 years in one place was possible. But through the power of prayer, staying connected to God, and experiencing God's mercies again and again and again in our lives, here we are, about to complete 20 years together, hoping and praying God gives us 15 or 20 more years, then retirement will come. At some point, here is what our hope is. But, we'll have to see. You all have a say in that. We're not pushing ourselves on you. We can trust that God will be just to vindicate us, to extend his mercy to us. That's what these two parables are about. So brothers and sisters, pray. There's power in prayer. Pray to connect with God. Pray to receive God's mercy. Pray to be strengthened for the battles that are sure to come. Every one of us is going to face battles again and again and again in our lives. God doesn't walk away in the midst of the battle. God's there. God doesn't always help solve the battle in the way that we tell him to solve the battle, or we'd like him to solve the battle, but God is there in the midst of it, giving us strength. So in these parables, Jesus is teaching us to never give up, to keep the faith, to trust God. Now, as you know, and I don't have to tell you, it's been this way for a number of years. It's a reality that we face as a small congregation. Finances around here are tight. Actually, they're tighter than tight. I've been praying. Leadership team's been praying. You've been praying. I've been looking for a job, a second job that would kind of fit with this, that wouldn't take away from my ability to be available and to do the things that I do in the community. And as you know, God has been blessing the ministry that we've been doing through the Camden Community Garden and through community gardens in our community, as well as through the summer lunch program, which is an extension of the Camden Community Garden. For instance, on Friday, the Board of Ed served their last meal for the summer, August 9th. Do you know when school starts? September 3. Do you know what the Board of Ed has been doing? They've been feeding all these students all summer long that got free and reduced lunches. Actually, we don't care if they get free and reduced lunch. We feed anybody under 18 that comes. But they've been feeding students because that's what they do in school, and so they wanted to continue that through the summer, yet they don't keep on going for the last 3 weeks of summer. And so it's like those kids don't no longer have a need. Now, I know English. I slipped out saying don't no longer have a need. I know better than that. You know, it's like those kids no longer have a need. But they do. And so we, at summer lunch, we wanted to provide for food for the end, through the end of the summer, all the way till school starts. Yet this congregation can't afford to do that. So we were struggling with how to do that. So you know what I did at the beginning, before we even started summer lunch, knowing that we had this need, I put it out on Facebook. You know, what would we do without Facebook? It's a wonderful tool. Now, it's an evil tool too. It's depending on how you use it. But I try to really use it for good. And God honored that in this way. And that's why I'm telling you this story. And I've told you some of this before. Some of this is new. So immediately before we started, I put it out on Facebook. And a person contacted me and wanted to know how much it would take to feed the kids for the last 3 weeks. They contacted me before we even started. Now, if you know anything about the way it begins slow. The first day, you might have 8 kids or 12 kids. The next day, you might have a few more. And the next day, you might have a few more. And then after a couple of weeks, you get to see kind of where it levels out. And so we've leveled out somewhere around 30 kids. But I didn't know that before the program started when this person said, how much will it take? So I contacted her back and I said, I have no idea. I'll get back with you in a couple of weeks. It'll take a couple of weeks till it levels out, until I can get a sense of an average and tell you a better number. Well, the very next week, she contacted me again on Facebook, the very week it started, and said, how about I want to cut you a check. How about I cut you a check for $1,500? Well, that's $1,500 more than I had. And I'm like, okay, yeah, I don't have any idea if that's going to be enough or too much. But if you want to cut a check for $1,500, send me a check for $1,500. And so when I told her who I was, you know, I was messaging back and forth with her on the Garden Facebook page. So when she wanted to know where to send the check, I had to tell her my name and my address, and that I was pastor. She needed to make the check out to Community of Joy, because that's how we operate the garden funds. And she said, oh, if you're the pastor of Community of Joy, you ought to know about our organization, and we ought to sit down and meet together. Now, I never heard of this organization. I didn't know this lady either. I did know who she was because she was operating from her personal Facebook page. She wasn't operating under the Camden Community Garden or like I was. And I had never heard of her. I mean, I might have heard of her, but I didn't know her at all. And the organization was called the Christian Leadership and Community Foundation. Never heard of it. So I said, yeah, let's meet. Sounds, you want to meet? You're giving me $1,500. It might be valuable for us to meet, but I have no idea. So she said, well, I'm out of my office the end of this week. I'll be back in next week. I'll get back in touch with you about a date. Well, next week came and went, and the next week came and went. The check came. We cashed the check. It's in the account. It's ready to be used for 2 weeks of the 3 weeks that we need. United Way is going to take care of the third week, or really the first week. They came to us also and wanted to line up a business each day to do the food, and they're taking care of that this first week. So anyhow, all these weeks came and went. Summer lunch is almost over, and I didn't hear from this lady to get together. And on Tuesday, she sent me a message, and she said, hey, I have some time. Any chance you're available to meet today? I need 15 to 20 minutes of your time. Well, I had planned to be at Old Town Deli to work on this sermon. And so I was at Old Town Deli, and I said to her, yeah, I'll be at Old Town Deli from this time to this time. And I have to leave at this time to go to summer lunch, so I won't be able, if you come too close to that time, we won't be able to talk long because I have to be at summer lunch. And so she said, okay, I'll be there. So I walk into Old Town Deli, and it happens to be a day that the mayor is doing office hours. He's been doing office hours in different coffee shops and places where the public can come and talk to him. So I walk in there, and I'm working on my sermon. He's done talking to the person he's talking to. He comes up, sits down with me, talking about sermon and how I do sermon and how I preach and all this kind of stuff, and talking about faith. And then we're talking a little bit about gardens. And in she comes, and I had seen her on Facebook, so I knew who to look for. And I said to him, I'm sorry, I'm going to need to meet with this lady. She gave us money for summer lunch. And she walks up, oh, hey, Jake, how are you? She knows him. He knows her. They sit down. The three of us are having this meeting. And then she starts to tell me about her organization and about what they do. Well, you remember a number of years ago now, down in Princess Anne, there was a radio station, a Christian radio station, 102.5, Joy Radio. Joy. Well, she manages the fund that was set up with the assets from the sale of all of that. And their desire is to bless churches and Christian organizations that are doing hands-on missional work in their community. That's where the $1,500 came from. And she said they also have found that a number of churches are struggling with finding resources for ministry. And so they have gotten a number of foundations that they're connected to that helped supply money for the radio station to stay in business when they were in business, and that they've now worked with those foundations and are connecting them to ministries like ours. She said, what if we could find a couple of foundations that would give some money to the church for you to do what you're doing? I said, well, that would sound like a prayer answered. That would be really wonderful. I couldn't even think about something like that. I mean, most grants don't cover salaries. But she said, I think there's two foundations that we work with on a regular basis that would be really excited to partner with you. One gave us $20,000 a year, and the other gave us $150,000 a year. And I think some of the things that you're doing are really wonderful. And I think they would excite them. So she said, give me a list of how the things you do in the community, all the things you do in the community outside of the church, and give me a list of the ways in which you think this foundation or other foundations can be helpful to the church. And so I sent her this list. And now I'm telling you about this because I want you to pray about it. Not because we're going to change God's perspective or influence or manipulate God, but we want to be in the will of God. And it feels like to me that God is working in ways that are beyond us, that I had no clue of, that might be helpful for us here at Community of Joy. And it might be helpful for some of the ministries that we've been about in this community that are making an impact, that if they don't continue to happen at the level that they've been happening, it won't have the impact at the level that it's been happening. I have no idea how God's going to work all this out. I don't know if a dollar will come from anywhere. I know that $1,500 came, and I know that a week's worth of meals came from a whole bunch, each a different business every day this coming week. But I trust that God is God, and that God will extend his mercies to us and will continue to work in and through us as we serve him and share his love in this community. Brothers and sisters, there's power in prayer. But not power in the way we think about power in prayer. It is not our power to manipulate God or to get God to do what we want when we want. It is the power to stay connected to God and be open to receiving his power in our lives, called his mercy. However God extends that mercy to us. That is the power of prayer.